My name is Gerald Watkins. I'm 63 years old and I drive a delivery truck for a regional grocery distributor out of Columbus, Ohio. Have been doing it for 31 years. Same route, mostly. Same early mornings, same coffee from the same gas station on Route 40, same boots I resoled twice before my wife finally threw them out. I'm not a complicated man, never wanted to be. I own a small house on Delmar Avenue that I paid off 8 years ago. Nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, a carport, a backyard where my father used to sit in the evenings and watch the light change over the neighbor's oak tree. I bought that house because it had a porch. He always said a house without a porch wasn't really a home. He was right about most things like that. My father's name is Earl. He's 81 now. He spent 42 years working in a foundry outside of Dayton, casting metal parts for engine blocks, brake housings, things that go inside machines that other people drive without ever wondering who made them. His hands show every one of those years. The knuckles are thick and permanently darkened in the creases. The kind of stain that doesn't come out no matter how long you scrub. When I was a boy, I used to trace those lines with my finger like they were roads on a map. To me, they were the most honest hands I'd ever seen. He raised me alone after my mother passed when I was 9. He never complained about it. He just showed up. Every morning, every school play, every busted bicycle chain, every nightmare I had in the dark. He showed up in the only way he knew how, quietly and completely. I want you to understand who my father is before I tell you what happened, because what happened didn't make sense unless you understood who he was first. My daughter's name is Renee. She's 34. She's sharp, driven, the kind of woman who reads 3 newspapers before 8 in the morning and has opinions about all of them. I'm proud of her in ways I don't always know how to say out loud. She works in corporate communications for a healthcare company downtown, wears blazers that cost more than my first car, and she married a man named Christopher Aldrich III. Yes, the third, about 4 years ago. Christopher is not a bad man. I want to be fair about that. He works in commercial real estate, went to Dartmouth, grew up in a suburb of Cincinnati where, from what I can tell, nobody's father ever worked in a foundry. He's polite to me in the way that people are polite when they're doing their best, but don't quite know how to close the distance. We talk about the weather, we talk about football sometimes, though I can tell he doesn't really care about it. We shake hands at the door. His parents are Richard and Pamela Aldridge. They live in a home that has a name, not a street address people actually use, a name. Heatherfield. They refer to it as Heatherfield the way other people refer to a place on a map. Pamela organizes charity galas. Richard sits on 3 corporate boards. They are the kind of people who have the same landscaper for 20 years and refer to him by his last name. I'm telling you all of this not to judge them. I'm telling you because context matters. Renee and Christopher's 4-year anniversary fell on a Saturday in October last year. Renee decided she wanted to mark it with a dinner. A real one, she said, at a place called Seren, which is a restaurant downtown that requires a reservation made roughly 2 months in advance and has a dress code listed on its website in a font that costs money just to look at. She called me on a Tuesday evening to invite me. I was happy. My father had been staying with me for a few weeks. His apartment building was doing some renovation work and the dust was bothering his lungs, so I told Renee I'd be bringing him along. There was a pause on the phone. "Daddy," she said, "it's a pretty formal dinner." "I know," I said. "We'll dress up." Another pause. "Okay," she said. "I'll let Christopher know." I didn't think anything of it. My father had a good suit. He'd worn it to my cousin's funeral 6 years ago and it still fit him fine. He pressed it himself the morning of the dinner, which I know because I found him standing over the ironing board at 7 in the morning, working the collar with the kind of concentration he used to give to machinery. "You don't have to do all that, Pop," I told him. "A man ought to look right when he goes somewhere nice," he said, not looking up from the iron. We arrived at Seren at 7. The place was everything the website promised. Dim lighting, white tablecloths, waiters who moved like they were trained not to make a sound. Christopher and Renee were already there, along with Richard and Pamela, and 2 of Christopher's cousins whose names I've already forgotten. Richard stood when I walked in. We shook hands. He looked at my father the way you look at something you weren't expecting to see. Not rude exactly, just recalibrating. Earl, my father said, extending his hand. Good to meet you. Richard, he said, and shook it once, briefly. We sat. The table was round and large enough that you had to raise your voice slightly to reach across it, which meant conversations naturally broke into smaller ones. I ended up talking to one of Christopher's cousins about highway construction, of all things. My father sat quietly beside me, reading the menu with his glasses pushed down to the end of his nose, the way he always does. It was Pamela who said it. I need to tell you exactly how it happened because the detail matters. The appetizers had just arrived. My father had ordered a simple salad. He reached across the table for the bread basket at the same moment that Pamela leaned toward Christopher's cousin and said, not whispering, but not projecting either, the volume of someone who said something in front of company before and knows how to make it sound accidental. I noticed when they came in. Does he work in a plant or something? That smell doesn't wash out easily. She was talking about my father. I heard it. The cousin heard it. I believe Renee heard it because her eyes went to her plate in a way that wasn't about the food. My father gave no sign that he heard. He placed the bread on his plate and set the basket back down, neatly, the way he does everything. His face didn't change. I sat with it for a moment. I want to be honest. There was a part of me that thought about letting it go. About looking away from it the same way you look away from a small fire and hope it doesn't spread. I've done that before, at other tables, in other rooms, with other comments that were aimed at men like my father and wrapped in the same soft packaging. But my father had pressed that suit at 7 in the morning. I set my fork down. I folded my napkin. I didn't raise my voice because my father never raised his voice, and I am his son. I looked at Renee first. I said, "Sweetheart, I'm going to take your grandfather for a walk. We'll be right back." Renee looked at me. I could see her reading my face and understanding more than I said. "Daddy, we'll be right back," I said again gently. I stood and I touched my father's shoulder. He looked up at me, Toiner, and in his eyes I could see that he had heard everything and had simply decided, the way he always decided, to be larger than the moment. He folded his own napkin without being asked, tucked it under the edge of his plate, and stood. We walked out together. The night air outside was cool and smelled like car exhaust and October leaves. My father stood on the sidewalk and looked out at the street. He didn't say anything right away. Neither did I. Finally, he said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know, I said. "I've heard worse, Betty," he said. "I know that too, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" And right there on that sidewalk I knew. I'd known probably since the moment I set my fork down. I took out my phone and I called a place called Rosie's on Frankfurt Street. It's a soul food restaurant that's been there since 1987. Formica countertops, ceiling fans, sweet tea that comes in mason jars. My father has been going there since before I was born. Miss Rosie herself, she's about 75 now and still comes in on weekends. Once told me that my father used to come in after his foundry shifts in the early 80s. Still in his work clothes, and she'd save him a corner booth and a plate of oxtails because she knew he wouldn't ask for it himself. I called. They had room. I said we'd be there in 15 minutes. Then I sent Renee a text. I didn't write much. I said, "Your grandfather and I are going to Rosie's. Come if you want. We'd love to have you." I put my phone in my pocket. I straightened my jacket. I looked at my father. "You hungry?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. And then Earl Watkins, 81 years old, 42 years in a foundry, hands like a map of honest work, smiled. "I could eat," he said. We walked to Rosie's. It's only 4 blocks from Seren, which I've always thought is funny. The way a city will put those two worlds right next to each other and act like the distance between them is longer than it is. Miss Rosie's niece was working the front when we came in. She took one look at my father and broke into a full smile and said, "Mr. Earl, we haven't seen you in months." My father shook her hand with both of his and asked about her son who had just started high school. We got the corner booth. The oxtails were perfect. The cornbread was sweet. The sweet tea came in mason jars like it always does, and my father drank 2 of them. We talked about things we hadn't talked about in a while. About the summer I turned 12, and he taught me to change a tire in the parking lot of a Kmart, because he said a man ought to know how to take care of himself on the road. About my mother, a little. About how the oak tree in the backyard was looking thin on one side and we probably needed to call someone about it. About 40 minutes into our meal, the door opened. Renee came in alone. She stood in the doorway for a second, scanning the room. When she found us, she walked over without hesitating and slid into the booth across from us. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at my father, and her eyes were wet in a way she was clearly trying to manage. "Grandpa," she said. My father reached across the table and patted her hand. "Sit down, baby," he said. "You want the oxtails. They're good tonight." She laughed, a little broken, and said yes. She told us that after we left, the table had gone very quiet. That Christopher had looked at his mother and said, calmly and clearly, that what she'd said was not acceptable in his presence or in connection with his family. That Pamela had looked around the table for support and found none. Not from Richard, not from the cousins. That the dinner had ended shortly after. I looked at my son-in-law differently after that night. I want to be honest about that. It's easy to write someone off as too polished, too distant, too much of a different world. But a man who will correct his own mother in public, at a table like that, in a restaurant like that takes something real. I'm still not great at talking football with him, but I understand him better now. What I want to tell you, what I've been circling around since I started talking, is something that took me a long time to understand, but that I've known in my bones, probably since I was 9 years old. Standing next to my father at my mother's funeral, and watching him hold himself together in a dark suit with a pressed collar. Class is not what some people think it is. I've sat across from people who had class written all over them, the right name, the right school, the right table at the right restaurant, and watched them say ugly things in soft voices because they'd learned how to wrap cruelty in good manners. And I've sat in a corner booth at Rosie's on Frankfurt Street with a man who spent 4 decades pouring metal in a hot foundry, whose hands carry a stain no soap can reach, and watched him pat my daughter's hand and tell her to sit down and eat something. That is class. That is what it looks like. The way you treat the people who built you is the most honest thing about you. Strip away the blazer, the restaurant, the last name with a number behind it, and what you have left is how you treat an old man in a pressed suit who asks for nothing and gives everything. My father is still with me. He's back in his own apartment now that the renovation finished, but he comes over on Sundays. We sit on the porch, the one I bought the house for, and we watch the light change over that oak tree. I've already called someone about the thin side. They said it's going to be fine, just needs some care. Most things do. If you've been carrying something like this, if you know someone whose worth got measured by the wrong things, by the wrong people, at the wrong table, I hope this story finds you tonight. Leave me a comment. Tell me about someone worth honoring. I'd really like to know. I'm Gerald Watkins. This is Voices of Uncle Walter. Thank you for being with us tonight.